Hi all! This episode of Physical Attraction is brought to you by the American National Standards Institute. Standards make the world go round, and they also dictate what is round. Without standardised measurements and definitions, physicists would be speaking to each other in different languages and would struggle to understand the universe even more than we already do. You can learn about standards in America at the ANSI blog at blog.ansi.org/pod to learn about how standards apply to you. Now on with the show.
Into his eyes. They're the eyes of a man.
Hello and welcome to Physical Attraction. So in this episode, I'm fortunate enough to interview Cornelius Schilt, perhaps better known to the world by his blog title, Corpus Newtonicum, which you can go and read at corpusnewtonicum.wordpress.com. He is a DPhil student at the University of Oxford, studying the history of science and focused on the life, career and works of Isaac Newton. What's more, he just handed in his thesis the day before I conducted this interview. Best of luck with the viva, CJ. In this, the second part of our interview, we talk about the context of the philosophy of the time and Newton's philosophy of the universe, Newton's personal life, his alchemy, and his legacy as a scientist and as a figure of genius. If you came to Newton without knowing very much, just what you learn in school about the apple hitting the man on the head and so on, I think the misconception that you might have is this is the age of reason that's being born out of a sort of religiously superstitious ignorance, and all of these people, although they might believe in God, are basically driven by this secular logic, this reasoning, this empiricism, this idea that truth comes through experiment and you observe things and come up with a theory that's then confirmed by more experiment, that is, in a way, agnostic to the creator or the creation of the universe. The only assumptions you need to bring into that philosophy of the world is that the universe behaves consistently according to a set of rules, and those rules could have been cast down by a divinely inspired figure, or they could have just arrived out of a random chance, or you can get into ideas about the anthropic principle and so on, about how only the universes with consistent logic have life to look at that logic and say, oh, isn't this marvellously logical? So I guess if you had this naive interpretation that Newton came out of the age of reason and was the first of these empiricism people, and everything else he did was sort of a strange sideshow. And I think in our modern era, it's very hyper-specialised, to the extent that you've just spent 5 years of your life studying a very small, a very important, very interesting, but a very small aspect of, and I am also studying a very, very small aspect of a very small behaviour of one climate model. So, we've become hyper-specialised, but of course, you have to remember that in Newton's day, and, they said Francis Bacon was the last person who knew everything.
There's also Athanasius Kircher.
Who?
Athanasius Kircher. There's actually a book in 2004 published called Athanasius Kircher, The Last Man Who Knew Everything.
Okay.
And this is about 1660, 1670. He's a French Jesuit philosopher.
Okay, interesting. So he was the last man who knew everything.
Yeah,
But what I'm saying is that we had more, in those days, we had everything was a discipline in a way that it isn't now.
Yeah, well, you said quite a few things in your introduction to this little statement, which you then labelled as naive. It's very understandable, I think, that we have this picture of Newton, because throughout the Enlightenment, this picture has been cultivated and then even enforced, if you like, in the 19th century. This idea of the age of reason. This same idea also invented, if you like, the concept of the flat Earth, of the Dark Ages, and more of those mythologies. Most of what we learned about the medieval period and about everything that happens until the 19th century, if you like, is very much distorted through an Enlightenment picture. Even the way the Enlightenment itself is presented today. And it's clearly the result of some form of political agenda and not equated with any nation's sort of policies, but an idea that science is by definition a rational attempt of understanding the Earth. It presupposes the fact that we humans are actually rational. Well, just look around you. Clearly, we are not. We are absolutely not rational.
And also that it was the first rational attempt. And the things that Newton was doing in terms of trying to establish a consistency with the biblical texts was somehow irrational.
Yes. Well, if you use rational in that sort of way, there have been so many rational revolutions, if you like, in history. I mean, the way that the Greeks looked at the world, which looks completely alien to us now, was incredibly rational, not just to them. It makes total sense once you accept that they had a different mindset and a different view of the world and a different view of the cosmos. And in a sense, many of the Greek philosophers were as agnostic or atheist as we are now. So it didn't even need to have the idea of a God. And when you think of it, if you like, when we talk about science today, what are the concepts that we work with? We work with mathematical symbolism. We use concepts like force, none of which can be defined. Well, they can be defined in mathematical symbolism again. But if I ask you what is a force, what is it? Then the proper answer would be, I don't know. We use it as a workable concept and it works. Just like we don't know why quantum mechanics works or why it works the way it works.
And there was this deeply philosophical debate that arose around that because the observations of quantum mechanics, things like wave particle duality, but also the idea that you cannot measure the specific location of a particle and ideas of non-local influences and things like this, went against what was previously considered to be a rational, natural, observed approach to the universe. And lots of people, I guess, when quantum mechanics came out, eventually almost just gave up on the problem in the Copenhagen interpretation.
Yeah.
So, let's just use it to calculate because it works well and hope that it makes a deeper sense later on with more understanding.
Exactly. Well, we're 70 years from that, and we still don't understand what it's all about. There was a reason why Einstein sort of refuted the whole idea. It simply did not fit his world frame.
It offended him.
It offended him deeply. But I find there's something slightly ironical in that in the 17th century, alchemy became less and less popular. Primarily, I mean, not so much because of the experiments that they did and everything, which can definitely be seen as a form of proto-chemistry, which is how it is understood today. But for the results they proclaimed, which they could then not reproduce, including the creation of the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life. The 17th century produced the experimental method as we have it now, which had to be. You had to be able to replicate it. You had to have witnesses show that could confirm that what you described was actually what you did and everything, and then they agreed on it, and so forth. And then Newton introduces mathematical symbolism, and you might actually say that he returns to the mystical descriptions of the alchemists in a sense. Yes. And this isn't, and then the French perfected in the 18th century with Laplace and Lagrange and the various others, and then comes quantum mechanics, which has, as far as we know, no or an undefinable relation with reality, to the extent that in one interpretation of quantum mechanics there is no reality.
And now physics is getting even further down this avenue. There was a very good book, I haven't finished reading it yet, but it's by this theoretical physicist called Sabine Hofstadter. It's called Lost in Math, and her whole thesis is talking about how with string theory and the latest sort of frontiers of theoretical physics, we have moved into a realm that is almost completely abstract and completely mathematical and works almost entirely in this, I suppose, symbolic realm. And the problem that's with string theory that a lot of people have is they can't come up with an experimental test that could prove or disprove it. And so in some sense it's completely abstracted from that empiricism and that reality. And I suppose in a way you could say that does start with Newton.
Yeah, I mean, I have no direct problems with string theory and the fact that it might actually take 100 years before we have.
Yeah, of course, we could just be ahead of the game.
Exactly, which as history of science shows has happened on numerous occasions. But let's not use the word rational for the moment. Oddly enough, we human beings aren't rational. Nature's laws are omnipresent and omnivalid until we reach the first seconds, and then everything goes haywire apparently. How do you explain for that singularity, if you like? There are so many things that we cannot answer. So, I mean, we accept quantum mechanics and general relativity because it works really well. So something about it has to be true.
Yes, there's a truth that arises out of its predictive power.
But the shift that we have made is from trying to understand everything about an object or about a theory, about nature, including where it comes from and what it is in its nature, to a very instrumentalist description. How does it work? And how can we make most sort of money out of it? But
that's somewhat of an aside, but comes into it certainly for sure. I think when we look at the philosophical interpretation of Newtonian mechanics, and I'm speaking specifically about the physics side here, Newton's laws, things accelerate when you push on them. If you don't push on something, it will keep going at the same speed or staying still forever. And there's this equal and opposite reaction to every action. And the law of gravity, of course. If you take the philosophical implications of this with no other aspects of physics, it seems to me that you can, if you're only smart enough to measure the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, you can trace everything backwards to its origin.
Yes.
And you can trace everything forwards to the future.
You have a wholly predictive...
You have a completely predictable...
and deterministic model.
Deterministic model.
Yeah.
And of course nowadays in modern physics we don't view our physics as being as deterministic and as predictable as that. You can do some reverse extrapolation and you can do some forward interpolation, but you can't deduce, there are some things that are almost unknowable and indeed that change when you measure them. So when Newton came up with this Newtonian mechanics, do you get any sense that he dwelled much on the philosophical implications of being able to track everything forward and reverse everything backwards to the start of time like this? Because it would seem to me like a mind like his would think, well, if this can be done, would it not be possible to reverse time back to the moment of creation and forward to the end? I mean, and if the universe is deterministic, does that not fit into a belief in prophecy?
Now, Newton's universe is not entirely deterministic. That's very important because although, let's say, formula-wise, it might be, Newton realized that his measurements were not always in agreement with his theory. And of course, that had to do with the fact that they still had only 7 planets, if you like. They had no knowledge of Neptune or Pluto. I'm not entirely sure about Uranus as well. No, Uranus was only discovered in the 18th century. So they realized that there was something odd about the orbits of some of the outer planets, Jupiter and Saturn, in their system, that they did not behave with exact regularity. So if you then inputted that data into the model that Newton created, at some point it would sort of go haywire again. And Newton basically argued that was God's design. He had made an imperfect model, so he was basically needed to correct it. His hand was necessary. So Newton's deterministic model still has the need for a God to intervene, which is exactly what Newton desires.
And so he didn't view it as being incomplete in terms of the mathematics that he'd written down, but just requiring a nudge from the divine hand.
Which was as perfect as you could get. Because that's exactly the system he was trying to create. Descartes' previous model, with all its weird vortices and hypotheses, which could not be tested, was one of those closed models, which only involved a God who basically wound up not even wound it up, just put it into motion, and then it will be put into motion forever. So that it did not need the providential hand of a God. He called a deist model. That is, a God he creates, and then he steps away from it and just let it happen. Whereas Newton's God was a theist God, so a God that actively intervenes in nature and cares for his creation and his the human beings he created, of course, his children, if you like, his people. And it also allowed for miracles, which is also very important, because a miracle goes against the laws of nature.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a model that's completely deterministic, there is no room for miracles.
Yes, and there's Newtonian concerns with things like parting the Red Sea and so on.
Yeah, exactly. But this was exactly what made Newton the most popular scientist of his times, and gave him instant fame, because now there was a model that was slick. It had really nice mathematics. Mm-hmm. It was published in a book that no one understood.
Always good.
So it must be good. Yes. And it could be used to battle the atheists, because everyone who did not believe in a theist God was better finished in an atheist. The fact that Descartes was a devout Catholic didn't matter. He did not have, his model did not agree with a theist model, so he has to be an atheist. Mm-hmm. This is Protestant rhetoric in a nutshell. But Newton's model was ideal for this, and I mean in the Low Countries they had this guy called Baruch Spinoza, famous Dutch Jewish philosopher who died rather young, who might be considered the first true atheist, if you like.
Yes.
And again, his understanding of the world was, of course, one in which there was no room for providence, there was no room for miracles, if you like, and that was seen as a strong threat for society. Because if his ideas would be promulgated and spread out, this could lead to an overturn of the entire system.
Well, let's not forget that all of these kings are divinely appointed kings.
Ding dong.
And their whole legitimacy rests on the idea of a theistic God that's still intervening in the world and saying, oh, when you win the Wars of the Roses, that was my idea.
Yeah, there was a reason why Charles I lost his head. Mm. He could not understand how someone be able to remove him from the throne, which resulted in the removal of his head, which was an unfortunate consequence. But if you read the transcripts of the trials, it's sad and hilarious.
I read his final speech, or something that's supposedly transcribed of his deathbed speech, and he's asking God to forgive the people for what they're doing.
Yeah, because they were killing the anointed one, if you like.
And he definitely believed in that absolutism.
Absolutely.
It wasn't a useful propaganda tool, it was a worldview.
Exactly. Wasn't also very useful for him, but hindsight. But so back to Newton. Or Newtonianism, if you like. Mm-hmm. Newtonianism is simply the whole concept of Newton's ideas, which is very ill defined because it can relate to his system of physics, his system of the world, his ideas of corpuscles, or his system, including its theistic worldview, if you like. Mm-hmm. But let's use that last definition. So here we have a form of science that includes all of accepted religion, as it was understood in most of Western Europe. So Newton was then put down as a herald, as a paragon of science, and he became the first scientific idol exactly for this. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why he's buried in Westminster Chapel.
Yes, because in a sense, and this is the thing that I'm asked quite often about physics and science in general, is this modern day perceived contradiction between science and religion. Yeah. And this, I think, is a big reason why people will struggle with an understanding of Newton. You want to divorce the two personalities. One is rational and scientific, and the other one is still clinging to Dark Ages superstition. But I would say that there's a conflict between science and biblical literalism, such as the Earth being 6,000 years old. Yes. But there's no contradiction between science and religion per se, and what someone like Newton would have viewed his natural philosophical pursuits as doing is revealing truth from another source.
Absolutely. No, the science versus religion myth was of course promulgated in the late 19th century by Andrew Dixon White and Draper, with books like The History of the Warfare of Theology with Religion, or with Christendom. I'm a bit vague on the titles. So it's also simply called the warfare hypothesis, which has no empirical data, if you like, or verification.
It's kind of ironic.
Yes, it is ironic indeed. I mean, at its best or worst, they are separate realms, as Stephen Jay Gould once, non-overlapping mysteria. So you can be a religious person and then you work in a lab as a physicist, and two have nothing to do with each other, if you like, because what you read in your Bible is by definition not about nature. And I'm quite happy with that interpretation. I'm not sure if it works that way, but no, they're definitely not at war. And if they are at war in some people today, Richard Dawkins, for instance,
yes,
it's not then retrospectively applicable to the times before, let's say, the mid 18th century.
Absolutely. Yes, so I think we've talked quite a bit about how Newton's religious faith and scientific approach, they weren't something that he needed to reconcile, but rather something that were viewed as holistic aspects of the same truth-seeking pursuit.
Absolutely.
There's a couple of extra things that I'd like to talk about. Number one, we've come onto it already a little bit, but alchemy.
Oh, yeah.
So,
lovely.
Newton's alchemical pursuits, there is a famous saying, I don't know whether it's true or not, that Newton wrote more about alchemy than he did about physics. It's possibly true. Maybe.
It might be true, actually.
Yes.
I know there are about 8. So there is a special project on Newton's alchemy called the Chemistry of Isaac Newton. If you do chemistry and then you replace the E with a Y, and then you do .org, then you end up at a project hosted by the University of Indiana Bloomington, headed by Bill Newman, who is a historian of chemistry, alchemy, and especially Newton's alchemy. And they have, again, transcribed all of, I should say most of, Newton's alchemical or chemical, to use the old word, manuscripts. And they total, I think, 850,000 words. That's about 10% of Newton's total output. And I think it indeed rivals the natural philosophical materials if you, let's say, don't include the various sort of drafts for the Principia that he copied out verbatim.
And they're probably both shorter than his works on scripture and chronology.
Yes, absolutely, yes, because that's 50% of the total output, yeah.
So could you describe the field of alchemy as it was in Newton's day? And maybe what they were aiming at, the alchemists, and what they were attempting, what Newton in particular was attempting to do? Because we have this idea, of course, that they are attempting to transmute. They're trying to turn base elements into gold. And there's also concepts like the elixir of life, eternal youth, other strange properties that were believed to be possessed if you could just find the right concoction.
Now, to be fair, most of that is actually true when it comes to the early to mid 17th century. So the Philosopher's Stone is what everyone is looking for. This mythological, mystical, whatever, an element that can transmute base metals into gold. And it is a form of mercury, of liquid mercury. And that's basically what they knew. So stone is a very weird word here. I don't even know where it comes from, but it was always called the Philosopher's Stone, perhaps to mislead others. Because one thing with alchemy is that it's a strictly personal pursuit. And there is this thing of making money out of your secrets. So there were many alchemists, or pseudo-alchemists if you liked, who simply claimed that they had the recipe for making gold and would sell it to you if you let's say deposited $10 million American dollars in a Nigerian bank account. to use the modern equivalent.
If people all believe in alchemy, then it's a good scam to pull.
It worked. There are plenty of stories of scams that go well into the 18th century, actually, because everyone wanted to have this Philosopher's Stone.
And in many ways, then they have discovered the secret of turning base metals into gold, which is to trick people into thinking you can.
Exactly.
And take their gold.
I mean, people like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle were also trying to find this Philosopher's Stone, which is clear from a letter that Newton writes in 1676 to the then Secretary of the Royal Society, Henry Oldenburg, gossiping about Robert Boyle, who apparently was discussing transmuting metal into gold in various pubs, having had one or two too many. And Newton says it's extremely dangerous what he's doing. And he was probably referring to the fact that if you have an unlimited supply of gold, bang, bang goes your economy.
Yeah, inflation.
Inflation. And this is 20 years before Newton actually becomes warden of the mint. So, but as if his mind was already on money at the time. Yes. But basically what the study of alchemy consisted of was, first of all, trying to get your hand onto the very obscure alchemical texts, many of which were only circulating in handwritten manuscript material, so you had to be part of an intimate circle. There were books available, and more books became available throughout the 17th century, books that were written by people with names like Irenaeus Philalethes, a pseudonym for I love peace and the sort of stuff.
There's a Nicholas Flamel figure.
Nicholas Flamel, yes. George Ripley, allegedly a 15th century monk. Many of the alchemists were traditionally were monks, because apparently they had all the time in the world to go into their laboratories and do all their secret experiments. And then all these books contained this weird sort of poetical form of writing, which we began this whole thing, my first introduction to Newton, which was, in a sense, a form of transmitting knowledge in such a way that it wasn't entirely obvious and would only be understandable to someone who was already in the know.
Yes, so there's an example I have here, which is the metalline form of antimony being referred to as the menstrual blood of the sordid whore.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a very arcane code that was used.
Oh, well, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, there's a few books on Newton's alchemy, one titled The Hunting of the Green Lion. But basically what the alchemists actually did was they described in a very poetical form what they saw happening when they were heating up metals and creating base chemical reactions at the furnace. Or when they put something into acid and let it sit for weeks and weeks and weeks. You can basically see metalline trees growing, if you like. And if you go onto the chemistry of Isaac Newton's website, you can see examples of that, because we have tried to replicate those experiments. That's Bill Newman, together with Larry Principe, another eminent historian of chemistry himself, with a PhD in chemistry, so he actually knows what he talks about. Yeah. Trying to replicate this. He did a roadshow at some point when he did it all on a stage, actually, which was brilliant. Also explaining that in order to replicate those experiments, you had to work with the same corrupted materials that they work with.
Yes, you have to say you can only get this substance up to such and such a purity with the equipment they have in the day. You can't use everything like we would do.
Exactly. Use the same metal ores that they use, and so forth, and so forth. And then, for instance, something that's being described as a gentle falling of snow is indeed seen in tiny white metally flakes that fall down. That sort of. So, in a sense, the poetical description makes sense.
Yes, and it is a sort of coded,
very
form
much coded.
Of observational science.
Yes.
You know, when you mix these substances together in this ratio, you observe this phenomenon.
And you have to learn this one way or the other, just like you have to learn modern day mathematics. But the thing with alchemy, contrary to modern day mathematics, with modern day mathematics, you don't need to be sort of, chosen by God, which the alchemists believe you had to be.
Or indeed inducted into a secret society.
Exactly, which was again the same as being chosen by God, because only through his intervention would you get to know these people and would they accept you, and one of them would then be your teacher. And it's interesting that this whole concept influences Newton in more than one way. So there is this search for the cause of gravity through the quintessence that we discussed. So he gets this from alchemy, from reading alchemical literature. The second way is more sort of hidden, but it's in his idea of how one learns about nature. First of all, again, you have to be chosen by God to understand what it's all about.
It's not entirely unself-serving point.
Absolutely, no. He believed he was one of the remnant, the true believers. So, by definition, he was chosen by God. Born on Christmas Day without a father. The whole shit. It all goes.
Yeah.
And this might also explain the slightly obscure way in which he wrote his first paper, which only through diligent study will you be able to understand what he is saying. So he doesn't make it easy for you. Again, and with the Principia, he does it again. Apparently, at some point, he told people around him that he wrote the Principia in a language, in an abstruse mathematical language, to avoid, smitherers in mathematics to start reading it and derive their own conclusions from it, basically. You had to have a very good grasp of mathematics.
The pursuit of knowledge is a means by which you approach the divine, and you have to put the effort in. And interpret the clues, the symbols.
Exactly. And he refers to this in his correspondence, in various sort of allusions, talking about that he wrote his first optical tract, that only including hints of things, so that those who understood natural philosophy well enough would be able to work out the other details themselves.
So alchemy by Newton's day had been made illegal.
So if you say by Newton's day, then somewhere in the early 18th century, we talk about 1720 or something, does it become highly suspicious? I'm not sure if it's already illegal.
Okay, so it's not illegal, but it's something that, for example, if the authorities found out you were pursuing, would not be
looked upon favourably.
It would not be looked upon. And is this because people viewed alchemists as scammers, or because they thought that they were potentially, because they believed in the pursuit of alchemy and thought they were going to unlock damaging secrets to society?
Basically, for the second reason, it was frowned upon by let's say, scientists in the early 18th century, simply because of the fact that none of the claims that alchemists had turned out to be true or could be reproduced. So it went against the now sort of shaping up scientific methods.
So to what extent can you look at alchemy and say, this is an early attempt to understand chemistry? Because they are the first sort of group of people who are dealing with, discrete substances that we now come to recognise as elements, and in the course of their experiments they'll discover things like some of these can't be reduced to other elements, and they're understanding that an ore is not a pure form of a metal, and things that we would now consider to be basic scientific facts that all of the alchemists would have encountered or discovered, and maybe got things wrong along the way.
I would say to the full extent, absolutely to the full extent. Whatever it's sort of embedding, alchemy at its purest form is protochemistry. Because it's exactly as you said. This is what they try to do. And that also makes the study of the history of alchemy very important for the understanding of chemistry as it is today. And actually many of the terms that we still have, like tincture or spirit of something, come directly from alchemy. We still have them.
And in some ways, a lot of what people try and do in chemistry is attempt to find substances with magical properties of some kind or other, or materials that will be. I was writing an article the other day about graphene, because one of the guys who co-discovered graphene came to Oxford and did a talk, and the thing that they were talking about there is that obviously graphene is a 2D layer of carbon atoms. And they've now found the same thing for silicon, and the same thing for germanium, and the same thing for tin. And the new movement in the field is to stack these together in something that's called van der Waals heterostructures. And each of these has different properties, and the guy compares it to Lego in a sense. Yeah. And of course, it's more informed now because they can go through on their computers and calculate what kind of properties the substances they're building are going to have. But still very much a new form of taking fundamental building blocks and trying to combine them in such a way as to give you material with the properties you like.
Exactly.
It's not an unscientific thing to do.
Scientific, the word you use it now, is again our modern term. But even if you look at it from a modern perspective, what the alchemists did at its core was pure science.
So as part of this conception of Isaac Newton as someone who was willing to go against established conventions, even if they were held by very smart people like Aristotle and Plato in the past, there are his religious beliefs which were essentially heretical, because in the Christian Church, as I understand it, for many hundreds of years, there was profound debate about the nature of the Trinity, which is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And, for example, in the Byzantine Empire, in the Roman Empire, there are constant heresies about whether the three figures of the Trinity are the same figure or aspects of the same figure. So people, particularly when it came to the nature of God the Father and God the Son, were debating about whether they had whether they were made of the same substance but similar essence, etc., etc., etc. Lots of seemingly... there's a really famous incident from history when the Mongols are invading from the east and they're destroying the Arabic Empire that has taken over most of the Byzantine territories. And it was believed by many in the West at the time that these invading Mongol forces were Christians too, and they were led by a mythological figure called Prester John. And the idea was that some of the people who they'd sent out to the Far East way back in the day had actually successfully converted lots and lots of these tribes to Christianity. But they were concerned that they had been converted into a heretical form of Christianity, where they had incorrect beliefs about the Trinity. So when the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan and perhaps his descendants after that, I'm not too sure, were invading the West, the Pope sent them a letter which explained in great detail the true nature of the Trinity. And that was more or less the only thing that he had to say to the Mongols, which is saying, just make sure you've got this Trinity stuff right. And the Mongols, of course, without much conception of how Christianity worked, said, evidently your God is on our side because we're winning all the battles. So, prepare to submit to us, Pope. But it was a very important strain of theology for, over 1,000 years was this nature of the Trinity, the three from one. And Newton's beliefs in this were against the orthodoxy of the day. So would you like to tell us about Newton the heretic and how it affected his life?
Newton the heretic, yeah. Well, it is a very interesting topic. One might wonder why in the church these debates were so fierce and led to all sorts of wow. It goes from murder to exile to excommunication. There's actually nothing worse than that, by the way. You might as well go to hell straight away. But it all has to do with the Christ's salvation and the extent of that. So basically, God creates heaven and earth, creates man, paradise, everything is good. Man is in direct communication with God, hence also how man actually understood everything about God and nature, because that's the direct communication. The fall happens because of sin, also involving an apple, just like Newton. And then how it all works is very intricate, but God then creates a plan to restore this, and it involves his son, Jesus, who voluntarily descends to earth, becomes man, the Incarnation, and dies sinless, and thereby restores the connection between God and his world. Some would say he died for the sins of mankind. That would be the Western Christian interpretation, and the Eastern Orthodox interpretation is like I said, he restores the relation between God and his creation as totality. And in that interpretation, the whole act of creation itself is already a break between God and what he now has just formed. So it's very complicated, it's very intricate.
So it's a question of whether he created Jesus in the same way that he created humans.
Well, that's one thing. Is Christ, for instance, the first creation? Because Christ is not just there at the Incarnation, he's already there. But when does he come into existence? Is it at the same time as God the Father? Or is he the first creation, which gives him a lesser status than God?
Exactly.
And it also informs one of the extent of his sacrifice. Because if he is on a lesser level than God, then how can he basically make up for what has been lost and so forth? So it's all very intricate. It's all very, very difficult. But it's also very difficult to understand from a, let's say, mathematical perspective, because in the Western Christian interpretation of the Trinity, there's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. They are three persons in one, consubstantial, homoousios, as it was decreed in the 4th century, of the same substance. So they're basically 300% and 100% at the same time, which is slightly difficult. Yeah. Now, for Newton grew up as a Trinitarian. It's part of his original Puritan beliefs. But at some point, and it's not entirely clear when, he becomes doubtful about the whole episode, and it's most clearest sort of exemplified in two letters that he writes to John Locke in November 1619. That they are letters to a friend, but we all know it's John Locke, where he basically explains what's probably his best reasons for not believing in the Trinity, namely that two key passages that promote the Trinity, key passages from Scriptures, one in the first letter to John, chapter 5, verses 6 to 8. The second one in the second letter to Timothy, chapter 3, verses 16. That are passages that defend the Trinity, key passages, but they are not used in the debates in the 4th century in which the Trinity is being discussed and eventually established as a dogma. This is the fight, if you like, between Athanasius, who defends the Orthodox, the Christian sort of the now mainstream Christian perspective, and that of Arius, who basically claimed that Christ was not on the same level as God. Mm-hmm. So Arius would never refer to Jesus as God the Son. Mm-hmm. He could refer to him as the Son, but not as God the Son.
Mm-hmm. And it's this Arian heresy that
this is the Arian
belief that the Mongols had as well.
Exactly, this is the Arian heresy, and Newton becomes an Arian. Now, there were many forms of anti-Trinitarianism in his days. There's Socinianism, there's Unitarianism, and it's not exactly clear whether Newton was a pure Arian as in the 4th century, or whether he had some additional beliefs. Mm-hmm. But he had made study of the history of the Church of the 4th century throughout the 1670s. It was the topic that he was most interested in. It might have been that he had. I mean, when in 1673 he says to Oldenburg, I resigned from the Royal Society, it's not because he's fed up with the debates and everything. He also finds that he has something more useful at his hands, which is the study of church history and of the prophecies.
And this concept that 1200 years ago people imperfectly transmitted the word of the Son of God and the intentions of God to the modern day, and everyone is being taught wrong information around you that renders them all heretical compared to reality.
In a sense, I mean, what Newton does, he compares all the excellent manuscripts that he has at his hand, consulting none of them directly, but all via the works of others. And so all the Greek translations of the New Testament, all the Latin translations and everything, and he looks at all the variant versions, and he basically says, well, here we have a Latin manuscript, which is a translation of the Greek, and it does not have it does not have those verses, those two verses that I just mentioned, those two passages. And here we have a Greek manuscript, which is not from the 4th century, but from the 8th century, and it has those verses, and so forth and so forth. So he proves, at least according to him, that it is actually, that those are later insertions. And to be fair, he's probably right. Mm-hmm. If you look up your modern Bible today, you will see those passages between block quotes, basically meaning not all manuscripts have these passages. Mm-hmm. So there was ample reason for him to sort of believe that Scripture was corrupted here. And his key argument is basically that in all the debates, the passages are not used. Mm-hmm. If these are the most obvious passages for the Trinity, which
why
they
aren't they mentioned? They must have been added in later.
And it makes total sense. It's Occam's razor again. Mm-hmm. Now, the one thing that Newton also believed was that one should never quarrel about the truth of the Trinity. Newton had made a very strict division between what he would call milk for babies and meat for grown-ups. And he does this in a draft writing that he called the Irenicum, which means the peace writ, and it's basically about how people should behave within the church and how they should discuss difference of dogma, difference of understanding. Now, the milk for babies, those are the basic tenets of Christianity. The existence of God, the fact that he created heaven and earth, the fact that he sent his son Jesus to die for the sins of mankind, all these things that are basically the Apostles' Creed. Mm-hmm. And the Apostles' Creed, sometimes known as the 12 Articles, does not mention the Trinity. It felt that concepts like the Trinity, or child baptism versus adult baptism and everything, where things that belong to a different realm, those of let's say the more experienced Christians, those that had received a deeper understanding, where they, like say, they were chosen, like he believes himself to be, and they would then understand things that other, let's say, normal Christians would not understand. Mm-hmm. At the same time, that meant it was useless to debate those things with ordinary Christians. And you should never quarrel about it. If you were Newton, you knew that the Trinity was a mistake. The concept of the Trinity was simply wrong. And as long as no one claimed that your salvation was dependent on a belief in the Trinity, there would be no reason to open your mouth about this. And he experienced this sort of. He experienced this first-handed. One of his disciples, William Whiston, who would take up Newton's vacant Lucasian chair after Newton leaves for London in 1696, is also an anti-Trinitarian. But he is a loud-mouthed man who feels that everyone should know the truth and that he is right about everything. So in 1707, Whiston has his coming out as an anti-Trinitarian and is expelled from all his official positions immediately. But
not killed.
Not killed. No. Technically, you would not be in the early 18th century. We have moved on. You might be fined for this. You might be dragged to court if someone really wanted to.
It's bad for your reputation.
It's very bad for your reputation, and you lose all your your privilege and everything. But Whiston turns to Newton, almost publicly asks him to help him.
Yeah, it's like, back me up on this.
And Newton gives him the finger. Newton says, "Sorry, Mr. Whiston, I think this is the end of our friendship."
Wow. So Newton is not concerned in the fact that he keeps his heresy a secret. He's not so much concerned, you think, about reputational damage as he is. It stems out of a philosophical belief that these things almost aren't worth talking about.
It's always the question, of course, how should we interpret Newton's words?
Yes.
He makes it seem that it's a philosophical stance. At the same time, reputation is, of course, also a thing.
Yeah.
And
he clearly cared about that.
He clearly cared about it. So the letters that he sends to John Locke in 1619, this is 3 years after the Principia, he is now, he's instant fame. He withdraws. He actually wants them published at some point, but anonymously. But then he withdraws his permission. The letters eventually end up with the same Jean Leclerc, who I mentioned earlier, who then does not publish them. He leaves them in the library of the Remonstrant Church in Amsterdam, and they get published in 1754 when both Newton and Leclerc have died. But by then, people had already realized that Newton was probably not as orthodox as people claimed him to be.
So when we talk about Newton in wider society, then he had his academic role as chair of Lucasian mathematics at Cambridge, I guess. Lucasian chair of mathematics. He had his academic role as Lucasian chair of mathematics at Cambridge, but he also had 2 other quite prominent public roles. One was in the House of Lords, and the other was this kind of sinecure, which I guess a sinecure is almost just a cushy job that you give to someone, where he was head of the Royal Mint.
Yeah, well, some of these happen simultaneously, of course. Yes. So Newton is being selected for the Convention Parliament after James II is ousted and William III of Orange is being installed.
The Glorious Revolution.
Glorious Revolution, of course, yes. And so in January 1689, while still Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, he goes to London to take up his seat. I think it's actually more in the House of Commons because it wasn't the Lords.
Right, the Commons.
So of course, in these days, Parliament would only come together when being called up by the King, and basically, which was basically when he needed money, and then Parliament would be dissolved again. So he there's not much known about his role in why and everything. He might have been selected because he was very prominent. He's a very prominent anti-Catholic. So 1685, when James II's reign begins, Cambridge is suddenly confronted with a Catholic friar, Father Alban, who James wants to become a master of Trinity College, Cambridge, which is unheard of. But this is a Protestant college which educates for Protestant ministers and the study of Protestant theology. So Newton vehemently protests against this and drags whomever I know to court and blah blah blah, and has to. So this might have been actually the cause for him being selected in Parliament. Not much is known about Newton's role there. I think his name appears in the books once when he's asked, "Could you please close the window?" or something of that nature.
Yes, that's right.
So yes, but the fact that he was this now 50 something, about 50, late 40-year-old, 47-year-old mathematician, Cambridge, instantly famous. It must have added some weight at some point. Now, we are on 1689 now. 1696 is when Newton leaves Cambridge for London. He basically gives up an academic position to become a very important figure in London and therefore British finance. First warden of the Mint and then master of the Mint. And he does a few remarkable things. The 1690s are problematic when you were at the Mint because of all the coiners and clippers. The people would basically scrape off the edges of coins.
So we should point out that inflation and so on then was far more linked to the gold content of coins and the physical value of coins as it is today. Now all our money is basically virtual and all of the notes are just promises to pay and so on. So. But in those days, a pound was supposedly a pound of gold. Exactly,
yes. You could basically, it was also made of gold, or of an alloy that at least had the same value of. So the intrinsic value of the coin was the same as the value that was stamped on the coin.
And counterfeiting coins drives up inflation because there's more in the supply.
It drives up inflation, and it's a really interesting way of generating your own, some profit. So Newton took up his new studies, if you like, with zeal, persecuting these coiners himself, dragging them to court, and in many cases signing their death warrants. This is interesting. At the same time, he's, by the way, still studying ancient civilizations and going through the motions of writing and a few extra things. We have a lot of these studies actually on papers that also have mint-related notes, which is incredibly helpful in dating when Newton was doing what.
I see. So almost in the margins of his religious and chronological studies, there's stuff about, I must do this at the Mint or vice versa.
Exactly. There's one note where he talks about the Million Act, which was accepted in 1694 when government needed £1 million to finance war with France, and a year after they only had, I think they obtained like £350,000, and there was this clause that everyone who wanted could basically get his money back in the form of bonds with 14% interest or something, quite lucrative, I would say. And
there's a war you hope to make a profit by winning.
Exactly. So and Newton makes a note about this on a page that also contains some of his chronology-related observations, so that it's incredibly helpful when you're a historian. But Newton thrives in London, you might say. First, a sort of reclusive figure in Cambridge, he now is part of big society. Within 3 years, he becomes master of the Mint, and probably uses some of his alchemical knowledge actually to improve the quality of the coins themselves and of the means how those coins are being made. Make sure that there's not a lot of leftover material, simply base design of the instruments and everything. And then, of course, in 1707 there's a union with Scotland, which together with Ireland, there's a need for a recoinage. So it's a massive project that he manages, and he does so remarkably well. In between, actually, there's two other important things. He becomes a knight, and he also becomes president of the Royal Society, which then helps, in when the Royal Society does a little investigation in the priority dispute, who invented calculus. Basically, the whole report is written by Newton himself.
Yes.
Though he was probably still the first, actually. and Leibniz then inventing calculus sort of independently about 10 years later. But of course, it's a little bit, well, whiffy.
Yes, it's
smelly.
It's not uncontroversial.
No.
And it kind of brings us on quite nicely, actually, to, I think there's a reputation that Newton has for, should we say, scientific feuds with people, particularly Robert Hooke.
Robert Hooke, yeah.
And this mercurial, sometimes quite aggressive personality that he had. And I think in a lot of histories he comes down as quite arrogant. And from what you're saying, given that he was not only worshipped as a scientific and mathematical rock star, but also a big man about London society, you can see how things might feed into that arrogance. I mean, how do you sort of view his... Because before Newton we had people whose word became the truth by dint of who said it, like Aristotle and Plato, and people who it was very difficult to question and were still being taught in the universities 1,000 years later. I mean, did Newton take on that same status during his life, and did it influence how he talked to other scientists?
Yes, it absolutely did. It absolutely did. I find it always helpful to distinguish between pre and post Principia Newton, because there's something very interesting happening when the Principia are being published. So pre-Principia Newton is, I always like to think of your average physicist. I have lived among them. So I have observed observational data, slightly sort of socially inept, prefer to be on your own, communicative not so much, leave me alone, I'm happy, I might have a little chat over dinner, but not too much, please. And I'm happy with my books and my lab or whatever. And this is basically Newton, locked away in his Trinity College chambers or in his alchemical laboratory, which he actually had in Trinity College gardens. So nothing secret there. That was all done in broad daylight. And he's happy what he is. He's published he's published a few mathematical letters, if you like, because that was the early correspondence. Nothing particular. He's made a telescope, which he has also given to the Royal Society, showing something of his experimental prowess, and also as an instrument maker. Then we have the episode with the new theory of writing colors. That first paper of his in 1672, and from Hooke's criticism is acid. Hooke first basically says, you stole all of this from me. You took it all from my micrographia. Now, that's no bueno, as my Ecuadorian housemate would say. This is striking directly, saying, Newton, you're a plagiarist. Then there are French Jesuits who basically claim that Newton's experiments cannot be replicated because they don't work. So they accuse him of sloppiness, and it strikes at his integrity.
Seems quite a sensitive man.
He was absolutely sensitive when it came to these matters. Yes, he was sensitive, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. And the reasons for it, well, we can only guess. It's simply his nature. But I think he was quite pleasant if you had just a normal discussion with him. But don't tell him that that his experiments don't work because he's sloppy, or don't accuse him of anything. So he got very fed up with Hooke, who kept on repeating these things. And the problem is that Hooke was actually a little bit right. Newton had taken things from macrographia. Hooke is one of those sad figures in science who is very intelligent, has brilliant ideas, but does not have the mathematical prowess to work them out. And this whole episode is repeated verbatim in the 1680s. It's Hooke who brings up discussions of an inverse square law of gravity.
It's elliptical motions of the planet.
Elliptical motions, where the Kepler's laws and the inverse square laws of gravity are compatible, one way or the other. It's Hooke who brings it up. It's Newton whose first reply in letters to Hooke is wrong. It's Hooke who has a discussion with Edmund Halley about this in Gresham College or in a pub in London. It's Edmund Halley who comes to Newton in 1684. Newton is doing nothing remotely physics related, and then Newton starts writing the Principia. And in the earliest drafts for the preface of the whole thing, he mentions Hooke 6 or 7 times, thanking him for all the inspiration. So we are 15 years from 1672. I wouldn't say that the rift is healed, but he can at least admit that he took ideas from Hooke. And then the first book is read out in 1686 at the Royal Society, so a year before the official publication, and Hooke explodes. The preface isn't read out, Newton's still working on it, but Hooke explodes and accuses Newton of blatant plagiarism. Newton steals his ideas.
Takes all the credit.
Oh my God, and Halley and Oldenburg and others correspondents try to communicate to Newton what happened, because Newton was still in Cambridge, and you can basically see Newton search for that preface and put it on his desk and take his pen and erase, and Hooke's name is erased from the Principia.
So there's a very famous thing, which is an anecdote that I believe to be true, but I don't know whether it's true or not, so you can tell me whether it's true or not. But certainly it is the case that if you look on the side of a £2 coin here in Britain, the phrase "standing on the shoulders of giants" is that. And this is something that Newton wrote about Hooke. He wrote to Hooke, he said, "If I have seen further than by reading your work," whatever it was he'd written, "then it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And this has become a phrase that's embedded in British culture, and the story that I heard about it is that this is a jab at Hooke, because Hooke was short, and he was giving him a sort of backhanded compliment, so to speak. I mean, do you think we can interpret it this way? I don't know the context of when that remark was made.
Well, I think this is closer to the truth than the original statement, which basically suggested that Newton praised Hooke for his contributions.
Because it doesn't seem much like Newton to praise Hooke without some reservation.
We are in 1679, and Hooke has now become Secretary of the Royal Society. Oldenburg dies in 1677, so we're 7 years from that new theory paper, and Newton has withdrawn in seclusion. He's not corresponding anymore about these matters, and Hooke likes input. He wants copy for the philosophical transaction. So he writes this letter to Newton praising him and just trying to heal the rift, if he says, and he's suggesting that they have a sort of a friendly correspondence about matters and everything, and then Newton replies saying, "Oh yes, let's do it." Of course, there's no follow up. But let's do it, and yes, and if I have seen further, it's only by standing on the shoulders of giants and everything. And well, Hooke was not just short; he was also stooped. So standing on his shoulders would be rather easy.
I see.
So I don't think the question is whether it was a veiled insult. It was a very clear insult. I think that's also why there's no follow-up letter from Hooke.
I see.
Because we would have had that letter still.
It's fascinating because this, as I say, it's made it onto the side of the £2 coin. I wonder how many people would know that it was actually this kind of jab at a rival, a scientific rival.
Well, apparently more and more people now, but yes.
Hopefully everyone listening to this show can now at least share that anecdote next time they have a £2 coin on them. I don't know if it still says that on the side of the new £2 coin. I don't know if it still has the words on. It would be nice if it did, but I mean, as
kids, don't follow Newton's example.
Yes, indeed. Don't write horrible backhanded things to people who are reaching out in good faith to try and heal the divide.
If you are a scientist, just prove them wrong in your next paper.
Yes, and then, you can always thank them for helpful discussions at the bottom of the paper or whatever way you choose to do. Okay, so I think I have one final question to throw at you, which is, I don't think we'd get anywhere as historians if we didn't mention Newton's personal life and draw in some means of trying to interpret who he was as a person influenced his science, influenced his theology, his chronology, everything else. So I think we're all aware that there's a certain reputation, an archetype that we think of when we think of scientists, of a kind of towering, isolated genius, which is almost in a way, the way that you describe Newton, at least pre-Principia, as being this someone whose unique intellect is letting them make impossible scientific strides and breakthroughs, who are kind of misunderstood by lesser mortals, and whose fierce dedication enables them to compose great symphonies, and that almost the qualities of this rare genius and this towering figure leave very little room for anything else. So Newton, as far as we know, there's some debate about this, was never romantically involved. He never had a family, that we know, and he didn't spend a great deal of his time with friends. He had friends and close acquaintances that he wrote to, but he wasn't a socialite per se, I suppose. And he was mercurial in the original sense of the word, in the sense that not just maybe suffering from mercury poisoning, but also reportedly erratic, prone to these fits of anger and melancholy, and he at least has this reputation for being generally oblivious to whatever's outside of his current sort of field of interest. And even during Newton's own time, this legend was kind of springing up around him. So there's a quote on Corpus Newtonicum, which again you should all go and read, which is by the Marquis de l'Hôpital, who is known, to me at least, for his calculus rule and mathematician. He said of Isaac Newton, "Does he eat, drink and sleep like other men? I represent him to myself as a celestial genius, entirely disengaged from matter." And I think this is a thing that we've since applied to Einstein, to von Neumann, to any very intellectual figure, particularly physicists, throughout history, I would say. And perhaps more than anyone else, the image of Newton we have is responsible for shaping our concept of the mad scientist, the rare genius. And this stereotype, while it's interesting, and I think we like to celebrate these figures, I think it can be damaging to science and academia in the sense that breakthroughs can only be conducted by rare geniuses and Mozarts, and it's something that you have to be born with. And all this kind of, I think, and it's less and less true in the modern era, where science is increasingly an extremely collaborative effort. No one person could discover the Higgs boson. No one person could, observe the gravitational waves. And we have to acknowledge that we're in an era now where people have to specialise to more and more of an extent and contribute to things as a group. But when we look at this archetype, do you think, with everything you studied, do you think that this description fits Newton? And how would you assess his personal life, his personality? And it's a very broad
long question, and there's a lot in it. Yeah, so his personality first, and we already discussed it. Pre-Principia Newton, I mean, post-Principia Newton, he becomes an arrogant bastard. There's no other way of saying it. We know of his riffs with Hooke, but the Flamsteed episode is maybe even more symptomatic.
What was this?
So John Flamsteed is the Astronomer Royal. We are in about 1703, 1704, and Newton is thinking about a second edition for the Principia, for whom he has employed Roger Coates, famous mathematician who died rather young, to help him. And he's also, and this is interesting, incorporating matters from astronomy in his studies of ancient history. Because he realizes that if you read ancient poetry, like by Aratus or by Hipparchus, that describes the heaven in great detail, if you then simply figure out how precession works, then you can date when those poems were written, and you can date the events described in those poems, or when those astronomers lived, and so you can then those are sort of markers, milestones that you can help to determine all the other. So in any case, John Flamsteed is the Astronomer Royal. He has a meagre salary, and he's used that meagre salary to pay for all his own sort of equipment, and he's diligent, painstaking, collecting observational data, working through that data and everything, slowly preparing what would later become his famous star catalogue. But Newton wants the data. Flamsteed says, well, you can have my data, but not my raw data. I can give you my sort of my calculated data, if you like. And Newton doesn't agree. Newton wants the raw data because he doesn't trust Flamsteed's mathematical prowess. He's afraid that he gets wrong materials, basically, polluted materials, if you like, almost like you're selecting your stuff for alchemy. And he basically goes to Queen Anne and has Flamsteed's laboratory and all the materials confiscated. Ever since, Flamsteed, in his in his letters and correspondence, would refer to Isaac Newton as S-I-N, Sir Isaac Newton. Sin did this, sin did that. You can basically feel the
animosity,
but also the disappointment, because Flamsteed, in a sense, adored Newton.
Well, you would idolise him.
I idolise him. Which brings us to the second bit, that it's so ironic that a man who was so against idolatry, both from his Puritan background and his own convictions, basically, would become the first scientific idol, who was then turned in, and not just basically sort of, emphasizing particular aspects, but even creating a whole mythology surrounding him, like, the apple that fell on his head. I mean, Newton at age 83 relates to his wannabe biographer John Conduit that he was pondering about gravity, and that he suddenly realized that the same force that kept the moon in its orbit was also the force that would make an apple drop. And that, he equated the two. And that's basically the whole story. That's the apple. That's all of it. Which then became Newton was in his mother's orchard, having fled from the plague, and was sitting and dozed off. And then an apple dropped on his head, and lo and behold, he knew everything about gravity. And
that is a scene of divine inspiration too.
Of course, it's divine inspiration, but Newton, in a sense, helps shaping it as well. Because there's a reason why at age 83 he starts telling stories. He starts telling intimate details about his birth, the fact that he was so small that people thought he would not survive, and that the midwives basically took their time because he would be dead and anything, because that's what the doctor reported. But miraculously he survived, being born without a father on Christmas Day. So it's not...
He consciously builds up his own mythology.
He consciously builds it up. Yeah, so it's no surprise that after his death it just simply continues. He's the instigator of all of this. And in a sense, I don't believe there's anything wrong with that, with those sort of... Yes, let's have stories about people, but also let's try to understand how it relates to their, let's say, inventions, if you like. We come from an age of geniuses. When people like Einstein and Newton were seen as geniuses who single-handedly invented something so spectacular and no one else had thought about it, and only they could do it because of their specific background and circumstances. I think there's a lot wrong with that picture.
Yeah.
Now we are actually in an era when everyone can be special, which is basically saying absolutely nothing. Because special means different from. But if everyone can sing, no, that's not true. You should hear me under the shower. I mean, that's not how it works. I do believe that we are all differently gifted and talented, and some of us have an intimate understanding of mathematics. But you still need to put in all the hard work. You still need to go through all the motions and learn. But with some of it just comes sort of more natural than with others, and we see through the equation and everything. And those people are sort of more prone, I think, in discovering things from people who just go through the motions and learn by following examples and everything. They can become very skilled mathematicians. They will probably never make any great discoveries. Is this it's not just the hard work. There is something. Is it serendipity? At times it is. Sometimes just an event can happen. You're suddenly reminded of something through a smell, and that then brings up A and B and C and yeah. I mean, take Einstein as an example. Einstein is, of course, seen as the man who... I mean, we know he invented special relativity and then general relativity. But there's a reason why the most basic equations in Einstein's theories are called the Lorentz equations. Because they were constructed by the Dutch physicist Lorentz. And what Newton basically did was the same thing that Isaac Newton did. There were these theories around, and he just made the right combination. He did put in a lot of effort, all the mathematics that he invented, and the same with Einstein and how he combined all these elements, and so forth. So it's a combination of both, of being savvy enough to understand what's going on and how it works, being able enough to then combine it, having the techniques therefore, but also being in the right environment that allows you to do this. Einstein might still be sitting in his office in Switzerland, looking at patents.
If things were slightly different, if he'd had slightly different influences.
Exactly. So, with Newton, if Edmund Halley had not visited him, at the instigation of Robert Hooke, if you like, he would probably not have written the Principia. And he would be known as the man of the... Oh yes, He had this completely right theory about light and colours that was only accepted 50 years later or something, and he was a very, 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 very ample mathematician, but that's it. He would not have been the scientific idol whom he became.
The first of the scientific idols, or the last of the magicians.
Oh yeah, well there we go. John Maynard Keynes, beautiful. Yeah, well he was both. He was both, and he would have hated it because he was vehemently against idolatry. That's a key word that returns in everything that he writes, and it's so ironic.
CJ, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed and for giving me so much of your time and so much of your expertise and wisdom about Isaac Newton. And I'm sure if this is anything to go by, you have nothing to worry about with the Viva.
Well, cheers for that. Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks very much for listening to this episode of Physical Attraction. Our guest today was CJ Schilt, a History of Science DPhil student here at Oxford. In a few weeks' time, I have no doubt Dr. Schilt. If you want to find out more, you can follow him on Twitter, and do visit the blog Corpus Newtonicum. That's www.corpusnewtonicum.wordpress.com. You can also check out the Newton Project at www.newtonproject.ox.ac.uk, which CJ contributed to. It's an attempt to transcribe all of Newton's works. In the meantime, for us, just a few messages. Subscribe to the sister podcast, Autocracy Now, which deals with the history of notorious dictators. We're still going on and on about Stalin because his life was so long and he did so many terrible things to tell you about. You can follow us on Twitter at PhysicsPod. If you visit the website at www.physicspodcast.com, you'll be able to use the contact form to send us any of your comments, questions or concerns. I always like getting people's feedback. You'd also be able to donate to the show if you wish, or purchase some of the bonus episodes I've created for the low price of $3 using the PayPal link. But of course the best thing you can do to support the show is always to tell as many of your friends, enemies, people you've vaguely met, anyone who listens to podcasts, people who don't, anyone about the show. The listeners make it all worthwhile. Until next time, take care.